Okay, cool. Well, welcome everybody. We're really excited. Oh, yeah. Miriam, did you want to kick us off? I'm sorry, I totally forgot.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. I think you totally got it covered. Just the one thing I want to mention is that we do have closed captions available. So if you look at like the bottom of your Zoom screen where you have the options for like chat, participants, all of that stuff, there's a little closed captions button which you could click on and they should pop up.
Cool. Thanks, Miriam. Yeah, so we're super excited to be doing this teach-in today. This is sort of part 2 of our action earlier today. And yeah, we're just gonna get going. So we've been saying this, but if you want to throw your name and pronouns in the chat and where you're calling in from, it'd be nice to know who's in the room with us. Cool, yeah, so this is a teach-in from Sunrise Boston, all about, we're in the first full day of a Biden administration. So we're gonna just go over all the history of how we got here and what we can do to sort of fit, Biden and the new sort of international climate czar, John Kerry, into Sunrise's vision of a livable future. But first, let's introduce ourselves. So I'll start, we can go left to right. My name's Nick, I use he, him pronouns. I'm a volunteer with the Sunrise Boston Hub and part of the education team. And we'll pass to Anne.
Hey, I'm Anne. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a volunteer with Sunrise Boston as well with the education team and the member support team. I'm calling in from Wayland on Pawtucket and Massachusetts land.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex, also Sunrise volunteer with the education team. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from Medford, also Pawtucket land, very close to Tufts University. So we're very excited to have you all here. Anne and I will be answering questions in the chat if you have any.
Absolutely. Great. So really quick, before we even get into the whole gist of everything, hopefully these types of slides and me saying this is mostly redundant in 2021, but in case we have any new folks who have never heard of Sunrise, welcome. This whole teach-in is being put on by the Sunrise movement. We're one hub in the entire movement, which we'll get to in a sec. But what is Sunrise movement? We're a movement of young people to stop climate change and create millions of good paying jobs in the process. We do so by building people power, political power, and building towards a people's alignment so we can pass a Green New Deal and move towards a livable future. And specifically, the Boston Hub is one of over 400 hubs across the country. So after we started in 2017, we have certainly grown a lot in the past 4 years. The Boston Hub is one of the oldest, and we've had the pleasure to work with so many cool people along the way. But we're only a tiny part of one organization that's a tiny part of the entire, ecosystem of movements that is pushing for change and has unique opportunities in 2021 and beyond. So just as a quick rundown, the things we're going to talk about, the thing we're going to talk about tonight, and just as a reminder, this will go probably until 7:30, maybe a little earlier, is we're going to start off by sort of telling the history of the Green New Deal and why it even came into being. And then we're going to really shift focus and talk about Biden quite a bit. So this teach-in is centered around new President Biden, who was inaugurated yesterday, and former Secretary of State John Kerry, who is heading Biden's international sort of climate team. Kerry was the target of our action earlier today. We're outside of his house, sort of kicking off, starting to build momentum in this new administration. So we wanted to center all of the content around both of them. And then once we sort of tell the history of, how these two fit into our vision of a Green New Deal and how things have changed over time, we're going to use the last two sections to talk about differences between the Biden plan that's going to be put into effect very soon and what we're calling for, a Green New Deal. And then even give a taste of something that is outside of the realm of the Green New Deal and is pushing even farther for different visions of justice that aren't captured in a Green New Deal. So we'll get a taste of sort of everything, and then we'll wrap it up and tell you what you can do to be part of this momentum. But first, I want to start with some quick teacher requests. These are sort of kind of borrowed from our usual trainer requests. But the first is be present. I know in Zoom times, I'm on my computer, right? The fourth wall broken. I have like these two monitors and I could easily be very distracted and like fiddle around on my other stuff and look at my tabs and check my emails. But we ask that for this hour and a half that you all are with us, that we can be here together and be engaged with each other. And second, sort of Zoom norms. I think you are forcibly placed on mute, but if you're not, please place yourself on mute. And if you're not concerned about privacy stuff, because we are recording, sometimes it's nice to have your camera on so we can sort of expand, if you're seeing the participant view, expand people's cameras. So it's like, kind of like we are in the room together. And then finally, I'll be throwing out some questions that you can answer in the chat along the way, but also please feel free to like ask questions in the chat, say things, talk to other folks. Please don't try to be disruptive in any way. If something does happen, I don't know if we're past this these days, but if we do get Zoom bombed or something, we have a whole procedure to handle it, sort of, stop the thing that's going on and put up maybe some like nice calming graphic, and we ask everyone to go on mute or take your headphones out if something bad is being said over Zoom, or just you can kind of look away from your screen, and we'll take care of it and let you all know when you can come back. Hopefully nothing like that will happen. Yeah, so this is Zoom. You'll learn. Okay, onward. So first, we wanted to sort of start by talking about, why are we even talking about a Green New Deal? And this will sort of tell some of the history of the relationship between Biden and Kerry and our climate policy and where we come in as Sunrise Movement. So a big sort of topic of note that came up a lot yesterday, and I'm sure today as well, is as I'm sure a lot of you know, we re-entered the Paris Accords, right? We had recently left the Paris Accords during the Trump administration and had entered them under the previous Obama administration, Obama and Biden. And the Paris Accords were sort of the last big international agreement to try to limit emissions to start to combat climate change. They were signed in 2016. They were negotiated a handful of years earlier for quite a long time, and were designed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or 1.5 degrees ideally, but it was a little lax. And the Paris Accords, even though they were this big sort of momentous international consensus among hundreds of nations, had some issues. Specifically that the Accords were not legally binding, nor were they economically binding, but sort of assumed to be followed. I think the phrase was something about like, if countries don't hold up their end of the deal, they will feel sort of social pressure, and with countries that are doing a good job will give them a hard time. So it's sort of this like social dynamic to hold different nations accountable. And another sort of what is ending up being a pretty sizable issue is that the Paris Accord didn't account for any differences between really huge polluters like China or the US or India versus nations that really have had zero role in the climate crisis really at all and are more at risk, and seeing the effects even before these big countries who emit most of the greenhouse gases. So it was a simultaneous success to come to this international consensus, but with some flaws. And as you'll see, that's kind of a theme throughout the night today. And notably, Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, was a negotiator and a signatory to the United States for the Paris Accords. So, sort of one of the executive orders of the new Biden administration was, let's get into the Paris Accords again. And it's also worth noting, when we talk about the Paris Accords and a Green New Deal and stuff, often a lot of us don't know how our country specifically was doing even before we left the Accords. So when we made our pledge, when Secretary of State Kerry signed on to the Paris Accords, we were pledging to a 26 to 28% reduction in so these are US greenhouse gas emissions below our 2005 levels. And there's a bunch of more technical stuff going on. So it's excluding what gets sort of sucked up by land use. Do that reduction by 2025, right? And there's this really great website that I encourage you all to check out called the Climate Action Tracker that you can go in there and check out, how each country is doing. And if you go to the US, they actually say, and this is a group of scientists who all come together to sort of do this in their free time, which is wild, but scientists do that. They showed that under the current policies right before we left, the US may have, this is important, may have been able to reach the lower bound of our 2025 goal, so that 26% reduction. And they specifically say only because COVID happened. So suffice to say, we were not particularly on track. There was a significant reduction in emissions because of the coronavirus, because a lot of flying stopped and because for a while travel stopped. And there's a lot of sort of argumentation back and forth there about whether vehicle like car transport lessened or actually added emissions. But when you do all the calculations, there was a significant enough reduction that actually bumped us down, or I suppose up, to our goal. But without coronavirus, we may not have made it, which sort of was troubling. So then in a couple of years after that, after the Accords were signed, a lot of us know about this, but this huge IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out in 2018 and said, hey, you all remember that in the Accords, it was like, oh, let's limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees ideally. Well, they said, okay, that difference actually makes a huge difference. And a warming of 2 degrees Celsius will have much more catastrophic effects than a warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's this new goal, right? We can't breach 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And the report also included, and it should be noted that these reports are often a little conservative, but they did say this, that to stop warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, this is a quote, rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure. So they basically called for a huge shift in how our modern societies, our modern industrial societies are run. And they called for a serious reduction in emissions, 45% globally from 2010 levels by 2030, and total reduction by 2050, or else we would start to see pretty scary reinforcing effects from the warming. And this was sort of a wake-up call for a lot of people. This was a stark difference from the language that we had seen in the Paris Accords, where there's kind of this buffer. it's now more like, okay, no, we need to do something really fast. And, if you do the math, I sort of did it already, but the Paris Accords, right, 26 to 28% reduction by 2025. And the IPCC is like, no, we need a global 45% reduction by 2030. And you're like, okay, global, we're only one country, but the US is the third largest emitter on Earth. That's pretty bad. We were not really set up to avoid the most catastrophic effects of the climate crisis. So our heroes, two of our heroes, AOC and Ed Markey, so two, very newly elected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and our Senator Ed Markey introduced, I spoiled it, but this picture is so cute, them eating ice cream. They came in to save the day with the Green New Deal resolution. So this is a screenshot of the House resolution that AOC introduced, and Ed Markey introduced a similar one in the Senate. But this was a resolution that created waves, as I'm sure you all know, recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. And it, in a nutshell, set much more ambitious goals for how we need to address the climate crisis. In a nutshell, because it's actually very readable and I encourage you reading it. But in a nutshell, it accelerated the goal of 2030. We need to take the IPCC seriously. And we started using this language of a World War II style mobilization. The transition needs to be a just transition, centering equity and justice. So we need to prioritize frontline communities, more of a focus on environmental justice, and make sure we're prioritizing Indigenous sovereignty and learning from the wisdom of Indigenous peoples who, didn't ruin the world for us, so we did it for them. And finally, that doing this all is needs to simultaneously be fixing the broken systems that have led to this symptom of climate crisis in the first place. And, propose to do that through something like a jobs guarantee, creation of tons of affordable housing, unionized jobs at a point where, unionized labor is at an all-time low, and since the earliest movements, addressing things like food justice. I only put 4 things, but there are quite a few. But there's this idea that we both need to move faster and fix these systemic injustices that are actually leading to the climate crisis. It's not just emissions, it's actually much more. So that's how we got to the Green New Deal. Okay, so I'll pause, just take a breath, because I know that was a lot of history. It's usually our least favorite part. But now we can sort of say, okay, we have this vision of a Green New Deal, and Sunrise Movement has really been instrumental in, we had huge campaigns pushing for it. How does this square away with Biden? And how has he approached a Green New Deal in the recent past and maybe even more recently present? And maybe out of curiosity, if you want to put in the chat, just what do you know about Biden and a Green New Deal? Do you think he's a supporter? Do you think he absolutely hates it? What is the relationship? I'll read some of them. Biden doesn't love it. Fair. Might upset his big donors. Ooh, he's radicalized dramatically since Super Tuesday. All right, now they're really pouring in. Not fit for it in his debates. A little wary of, yeah, this is a good one. A little wary of the words Green New Deal. Yeah, so there's it's kind of complicated, right? Biden, well, as we'll see, Biden, in the left and the sort of Democratic Party wants to support things like this, but there is some sort of tension in oh, do we say Green New Deal or anything like that, because it's been very politicized. But let's dive in and see what we had. So some of you said this already. At the first presidential debate, yeah, Biden said point blank that he does not support a Green New Deal. And that was kind of sad, you know, upset our good ally there, Bernard. And yeah, a lot of us were pretty disappointed and surprised by this type of rhetoric. So as we were doing these sort of Democratic candidate sort of evaluations and, you know, throwing our weight into, you know, who we might support, Sunrise Movement made this scorecard. I don't know if any of you ended up seeing it, but we did this whole analysis of the climate plans of Biden and Warren and Sanders when they're all running against each other. And we rated all of their climate policies out of 200 points. And like, we went really in depth. And you can find it online too. It's pretty cool. You can still find it in like a cache. But suffice to say, in the end, Biden's original climate plan was not very good. So he said he didn't support a Green New Deal, but really didn't have an alternative. And we ended up giving it a very score that made waves. We gave him an F. And most notably, the areas that he scored the lowest in were emission reduction and like sort of ambition around that, which is concerning based on what we talked about and the need to reduce emissions. Biden scored a 4 out of 20, whereas Warren and Sanders were 19 and 20 respectively. Equity and justice, he scored quite low. And the total out of 200, yeah, was 75. I'm in school right now, and if I get that kind of grade on an assignment, I start to get kind of scared, right? I don't think I'm doing a very good job. And I think Biden knew this as well. So after being nominated as the Democratic candidate, you know, sort of there's this sort of period of reconciliation where, you know, we sort of think Biden knew to gather as much support as he could for the general election. He knew he needed the support of the people who were in the Sanders or the Warren camp. So they created this, what was called the Biden-Sanders Task Force to address Biden's climate plan. And all right, we're starting to see the thread weaving through the whole picture. John Kerry was part of this task force as a presidential climate envoy. So Kerry, right, who was instrumental in the Paris Accords, is now back in the picture, right? He's part of this task force that's like, how do we figure out how to get all these crazy Sanders kids and you know, all these crazy lefty folks onto the Biden platform that we know we need to win. And as this was all happening, you know, our executive director, Varshini, was part of the Biden-Sanders task force as well, and working with all these folks to sort of shape his policy. And she said, after working with Secretary Kerry, that, you know, she relayed back to us that he's actually really committed to engaging and listening to young voices. And I'm quoting her, even when we might not always agree, but ensuring that young people always have a seat at the table. And, you know, now Kerry became this sort of international climate secretary, or international sort of like climate liaison, whatever you want to call it. And we're very grateful for Secretary Kerry because he seems to be a really great ally who was really listening to us during these task force negotiations. But we wanted to push even further and say, oh, we need a domestic counterpart to John Kerry to push for even deeper cuts of emissions at home. And this is sort of how this whole task force shook out. And as a result, Biden's plans actually changed quite a bit. And we think it's really noteworthy and worth mentioning. And I think people in the movement really should know how these things changed as a result of sort of, you know, way back when I was like, Sunrise tries to build power through people power, political power, and building a people's alignment. This was people power and political power manifesting, right? The Democratic candidate knew he had to change his platform because there was such a massive will from people like us that it wasn't going to cut it the way it was. You know, the F is not good enough. So it changed. And this is why what we do works. So, all right, Biden's original plan called for $1.7 trillion investment over 10 years, was mostly focused on unionized labor and conservation, with a grand goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. And the one thing that we did get so far that hasn't changed is rejoin the Paris Accords. And this was sort of how it stood right before the task force. But after the task force, we actually got some pretty good movement. So instead of $1.7 trillion over 10 years, now we got $2 trillion over 4 years. So more money faster. And it comes out to like something like almost 3 times the amount of money per year, which is awesome. And as we'll get into a little later, maybe it's still not enough, but it's a great step. And also the task force pushed the Biden, whatever administration, if you want to call it that now, to create an entirely new environmental justice plan alongside the climate plan that already existed. And they committed to 40% of the investments that are part of this plan, which I should have mentioned is called his Build Back Better plan. So if you ever see that, that's what that means. This is his climate plan that changed after the task force. So 40% of the investments from this Build Back Better plan will go to historically disadvantaged communities. So originally, when it was only pretty much focused on sort of transitioning unionized labor jobs and like the coal and fossil fuel sectors over to clean energy jobs, now it's much more centering these ideas of equity and justice that are part of a Green New Deal. Even though Biden will say he doesn't support a Green New Deal, basically we made him change to a Green New Deal to a degree. And finally, the other biggest change was that instead of just carbon neutrality, right, which could include, we still put a bunch of pollution into the atmosphere, but we negate it. That's the whole neutrality part. We suck some out through like carbon sinks and sequestration. Instead of only carbon neutrality by 2050, he put out an even more bold carbon-free power sector by 2035. Which still, if you remember back to the IPCC report, right, we're shooting for 2030. So 2035 is certainly a big step up. It's not the whole thing, but a carbon-free power sector is a pretty big move. I think if I remember correctly, based on like a 2018 DOE, Department of Energy report of US emissions, I think the power sector amounted for something like 27%. Yeah, 27% of emissions in 2018. So this is a big chunk that'll be carbon free. So not even carbon neutral, but it literally won't make any emissions, which is fantastic and a huge step forward. So we're happy. But we also know we need to push more, because I won't flip all the way back to that slide, but there is more work that we need to do. And our vision of a Green New Deal is much more bold than this still. So we can get into some of the differences, and this sort of sets the stage of like, okay, this is where we're at on January 21st, 2021, right? This is the plan. We know we need to push even more. So what are we gonna push for that's different? We can take some inspiration from existing Green New Deal implementation proposals. So I'll just like demystify that really quick. What does that mean? So the resolution that I put on screen before was basically a framework saying generally we need these types of things to have a Green New Deal, and we'll leave the specific policy implementation until later. Well, since then, since February 2019, there have been proposals, notably from the presidential candidates who ran during the cycle last year, that were much closer to like, okay, this is how we're actually going to do a Green New Deal. So very specifically, we will take some inspiration from our friends, Senator Bernie Sanders and Governor Jay Inslee. If you all remember, Jay Inslee had honestly a really extensive plan to transition to something that looked like a Green New Deal. I think he called it his Evergreen Plan. And when he ended up dropping out of the Democratic primaries, Senator Sanders actually took on, he worked with Jay Inslee and took on a lot of aspects of this Evergreen Plan to bolster even further Sanders' version and vision of a Green New Deal. So we're going to take their combined efforts and compare it to the Biden plan to see maybe where we can push a little further. And I'm going to take a drink of water really quick. But while I'm drinking some water, maybe put in the chat, what are some areas you all think we could push a little farther on? I see food sovereignty, absolutely. A just transition for fossil fuel workers, absolutely. More on transport, definitely, that's a big one. Yeah, infrastructure for green transport, more public transit, that's a big one for sure. Yeah, we can link Biden's plan. Sustainable cities, that's awesome for sure. We need to even think bigger picture. More trees, biodiversity, that's a big one, right? If anyone's curious, there are other IPCC reports that comment on land use in addition to emissions. It's a huge part of the whole ecological picture. Carbon pricing. Oh, thanks, Miriam. That's really nice. Push back against the idea. Yeah, seriously, this like middle ground type of stuff. Push farther from the left, maybe. Yeah, these are great. These are awesome. And I think you all already have the idea, and we can, maybe you all should write these plans and give Sanders and Inslee some pointers next time. But regardless, we will go through. So first off, we can, I'm going to touch on sections that, this is not the whole thing. Like all their plans are actually really long, and I guess as sort of a plug, our hub has been sort of starting this whole education effort around digesting long plans like this so we can like make pretty nuanced critiques and figure out how to push even further. So we do have some more stuff on the Bernie Inslee plan. It'll sort of comment on parts that we don't even talk about in this teaching tonight. So make sure you follow us on Instagram and stuff. But we'll pick a few sections that I thought, that we thought had significant differences. So first, let's just talk about the renewable energy. How are we going to get there? What are we going to do? All right, so if we look at the Biden plan, right, it talks about things like, all right, how are we going to get there? We need some wind power, solar, nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture. Those are the things that he says on the website in his plan. Meanwhile, the Sanders-Inslee plan calls for wind, solar, and geothermal, specifically calling out they don't want any false solutions like nuclear or carbon capture. So this is the idea where there starts to even be a split on how do we do renewable energy, right? A lot of people advocate against nuclear energy because it creates waste in the process that we also don't know how to dispose of. It's not truly renewable, right? To our knowledge, we don't really have waste from solar power or wind power or water power, but something like nuclear produces stuff whose half-life is like 12,000 years, right, before it decays. And also carbon capture, right? It's this idea of like, are we shooting for neutrality or are we shooting for total, zero emissions? So we already see some differences. Further, we see in the Biden plan that there's a lot of sort of talking about targeting the airline emissions, vehicle emissions, revamping buildings, which is great, right? We definitely need things like that. But we can sort of start to see how does that compare with sort of maybe calls like a lot of you were saying with should we just build way better public transit, right? When we talk about would we want to connect the country with some total clean energy, high-speed rail? That's a step forward from airplane emissions, right? We might not even need airplanes, right? why don't we just advocate for better quality transport in general? Maybe we wouldn't need to drive our cars because there would be better transit in cities, right? And then let's see, the point on the right is not directly comparable, but still interesting. The Sanders-Inslee plan, this is a really notable thing that sort of ties through their whole thing. They advocate for any energy created through this renewable energy transition through federal programs should be publicly owned and sold to distributors with preferences for public power and cooperatively owned utilities. So there's this idea that starts to form of like, okay, once we like build the economy of the future that's like, you know, at scale and the right way to mitigate the crisis, who owns everything that gets built, right? Keep that in the back of your mind because that becomes a really interesting commentary on the differences. But finally, for renewable energy, we can even see, right, the Biden plan, we sort of talked about this, carbon-free power by 2035 and net zero no later than 2050. But the Sanders-Inslee plan, which, and I should have mentioned, they legitimately call it a Green New Deal, called for 100% renewable energy by 2030 at the latest. So totally in line with that IPCC report and on the timeline that we're trying to push. So this sort of starts to capture some of the differences. We can even go further. So we can talk about housing, right? It might not be obvious unless you're kind of in the world already why housing is even a big part of talking about the climate crisis at all, right? But if you look at it, on one hand, building emissions are a huge thing, right? Like my apartment, all of my neighbors, all the houses around me, all the apartment buildings around me create emissions, and this is a huge chunk that can be addressed by different housing policies, right? And even further, as part of the sort of equity and justice lens, we're not going to have a society that wouldn't lead to things like a climate crisis if that society is, you know, sort of ravaged by no affordable housing, homelessness and houselessness problem, and sort of all these things that could be addressed by looking at housing policy, right? So, all right, let's dive in. So on the Joe Biden plan, I get so messed up with the J, O, and the E as a flag. It's cool, but I always forget the E. But on the Biden plan, one of the immediate differences is, so under the housing section, right, Biden is calling for direct cash rebates and financing plans to upgrade homes to be more energy efficient. And if you sort of take that at face value, it's like, that's awesome. You know, it's a great way to incentivize people to be able to do these types of retrofits and changes to make our houses and apartments for landlords energy efficient and less using things, not using things like natural gas and stuff like that. But then if you take a look at the Sanders-Inslee plan, they sort of say a similar thing, right? We want to upgrade homes to be more energy efficient. That's like literally the same language, but they call for sliding scale grants. So the difference there is like, if you're getting a cash rebate, you had to pay in advance and then you get reimbursed, right? And a financing plan is like, hey, we'll kind of like help you figure out how to pay for it. But a grant is literally like, we know you probably don't have the money to afford something like this, which is the case for tons and tons of people. We will use the federal government to just give people grants on a sliding scale, which means, you know, folks who are who, you know, could be, I don't know if it would be means tested or whatever, but classified as poor or low income, get different grant options than people who may be like middle class or whatever that means, right? So it's this idea of like the way things are already done, like do you have the money to afford it already versus like you don't have the money, we will just give it to you because we, you know, also want to address equity at the same time. And another, you know, very direct point of comparison is the Biden plan calls for 1.5 million sustainable affordable housing units. And they say that'll help reduce the racial wealth gap, right? Which if you sort of dive into how housing plays a big role in sort of the, you know, racist ways that our structure sort of plays on class through the generations, because you don't inherit wealth if you don't have things like a home. They call for 1.5 million affordable housing units, but the Sanders-Inslee plan, which is more close to a Green New Deal, calls for 7.4 million affordable housing units. And that's a huge difference, and that's sort of the scale that we're getting at. Like a Green New Deal is an even bigger scale. And we argue that things like that are necessary, right? So when we're fighting for housing justice, we need to fight for literally to eradicate homelessness and to not have unhoused people anymore. Because why, we know this in the coronavirus pandemic, why are so many unhoused people suffering while there's like empty hotels and apartment complexes that just happen to cost like multi-millions of dollars to live in? It's kind of nuts. So maybe we should rethink our priorities and create a ton of sustainable, affordable houses. And then the sort of Sanders-Inslee Green New Deal plan goes even further to call for just ending fossil fuel use in buildings by 2030. So again, it's sort of that stronger timeline. And I think, yeah, this is the last sort of subsection. One of the other things that a bunch of you mentioned was agriculture, right? So this is a huge, huge part of the ecology piece that plays into it. It's a huge part in emissions. And, the Biden plan, its sort of strengths lie in, it calls for the creation of 250,000 jobs, sort of plugging up abandoned oil and natural gas wells or repositories, reclaiming abandoned mines, right? He even called, I think, for the recreation, sort of as a Green New Deal did, the Civilian Conservation Corps to do this type of work. So he's really good on this creation of jobs type of thing to address the crisis. But also calls for things like, and this is where the nuance comes in, decarbonizing food and agriculture sector, right? With like research into soil management. He called for a whole new branch of the governmental research program. He called it ARPA-C for like Advanced Research Projects Agency, I think, for climate. So there's sort of this idea that we need to research like soil management, plant biologies, like new carbon sequestration technologies. And finally also called for, this was an interesting one. He said this was going to be an executive order, but I don't think it actually happened. But he called for the funding of the first biofuel plants and jobs to try to, he argues throughout the plan in a couple of areas that sort of biofuels are the fuels of the future, right? Clean fuels, so to speak. And there are a lot of differences that we can talk about there. So we'll get into it with the Sanders-Inslee plan, which doesn't as much call for like, you can sort of view like decarbonizing sectors as like, we're going to keep them, but we're going to make them better. This research into soil management and stuff is like, we're going to like make up technological solutions to stuff, but sort of keep it largely the way it is. Whereas a Green New Deal style plan says, right, we need to invest in regenerative agricultural practices, which is like literally rethinking our relationship with the land when we're doing agriculture. Also calls for carbon sequestration, but also, right, investment in this idea of cooperatively or community-owned grocery stores, sort of addressing the food justice issue, no more food deserts. But this idea that we need to fund communities, right, to do this. It can't just like come from the top and be this technocratic solution, but we really need to put the power back into folks who are like actually doing the work and could stand to benefit. And the plan actually straight up calls to break up big agribusiness. So, right, this is like literally a change to the structure of the society that we live in now. Would agriculture be something that's dominated by a few industries and a few corporations like Monsanto and others, Cargill? Or do we say, no, this is actually a huge piece of the problem. We need to break up these businesses so we can encourage more competition, release all these crazy patent types of laws and go back to more sort of local, bottom up, sort of locally owned solutions. And finally, they call for, this is a huge, huge historical trauma and like huge injustice. They call for prioritizing disadvantaged and beginning farmers. So like for centuries, right? You know, you can look at statistics that just say, you know, the vast, vast, vast majority of farmers in the US are white. And Black farmers have been oppressed throughout the generations, even going back so far as to when they were first freed from slavery. Jim Crow laws started to just repress them and not even give them land that they were promised if they wanted to farm. And this has had, you know, repercussions throughout the generations and throughout the centuries. And the same is true for indigenous peoples, right? We literally kicked them off of their land. And there aren't that many indigenous farmers compared to these huge agribusiness, you know, majority sort of white governed structures. So a Green New Deal style plan would call for, yeah, we need to like recognize tribal land and, you know, prioritize Black farmers, cooperatively owned farms, give a pathway to citizenship for migrant farm workers, which is a huge part of like, you know, people may relegate it to like, oh, that's just a want for justice. But if you view like big agribusiness and this consolidated industry as part of the problem, because they're leading to a ton of emissions and they may never change unless they're forced to, then it's not just that justice is a nice to have. Justice is literally part of the solution. Right? So we can't have mitigation of the climate crisis unless we have, you know, agricultural justice. So, okay, that was a lot. And that's all sort of to say, like, if we crunch it down and take away the lessons learned, it's in the Biden plan, right? There is an emphasis on job creation, and that's some of the stuff that we pushed him even more on. But for already existing big industries, right? If, you know, airline, auto manufacturing, big agribusiness, these are sort of the corporate interests that already dominate our society. And even with that emphasis, right, on job creation, but for the structures that already exist, this plan doesn't even call for nearly as many jobs, houses, et cetera, as the Green New Deal would. And sort of in sum, right, you can think of it as targeting the symptoms of the crisis rather than the underlying causes. And it really keeps existing power structures in place rather than really trying to address the roots, right? Meanwhile, on the other side, we see, you know, across the board an emphasis on community and public ownership and reshaping existing problematic industries. It's not like these industries would ever go away forever, right? But we would, you know, re-implement the way that power works in the structure. You know, the Green New Deal style plan has even bigger calls for jobs. It calls for a jobs guarantee. So there would be literally zero unemployment in the nation. And it's something that has been called for even 100 years ago in the first New Deal and afterwards. And, you know, housing for everybody. It's not a nice to have, it's part of the actual, you know, solving the problem. And it's generally a Green New Deal would be more interested in getting at the roots, like I said, and shifting where power lies rather than sort of keeping this corporate dominated sort of monopolistic system. Okay, so, all right, let me just take a pause. Maybe throw in the chat, just so I can check my time too. Throw in the chat, what is the most exciting thing that I talked about? Like, for me, this vision of a Green New Deal is like hella exciting. Like, I want this world and I want it now, right? I would literally quit my job to work one of these way better jobs. Yeah, what do you all want? Literally everything. I'm with you. Yeah. Community and worker ownership, seriously, why don't we have such a right to our work? Give me it all. Give it all. A world that's not run by huge corporations? Absolutely. It's such a difficult part of the problem to grapple with. Cooperatively owned, supporting disadvantaged farmers, community level. We as people had to know, oh yeah, that's an exciting part for me too. Yeah, we should continue to remind ourselves that even though, you know, I just spent a decent chunk of time talking about like how we could make the plan even better, it's really notable that we already shifted it a great deal, and we can do it again, right? As long as we keep these even more bold visions in our mind, we can continue to push and continue to shape the plans. Yeah, so thanks for dropping your favorite parts in the chat. You all are inspiring me too. So like, I'm so excited to like get working on stuff like this. But you know, it doesn't even end there. We can envision things that are even more bold. You know, I was just talking about, oh crap, I spoiled it. Pretend you didn't see that. I was just talking about plans from politicians, right? But when we do movement work, often we get to work outside the bounds of what seems like politically possible, even though I absolutely hate that phrase. So we can look at even more radical plans that in honesty aren't that radical, but for whatever reason, people think that, you know, they're coming away from the left or stuff like that. So we picked one to look at in particular. We wanted to give just a really, really nutshell overview of the Red Deal. And has anyone heard of the Red Deal? Maybe throw like a exclamation or plus in the chat if you've heard of it. Seen some pluses. Yeah, this is like a rad envisioning of what a just world could look like by an organization called the Red Nation, which is a coalition of Native and non-Native activists, educators, students, and community organizers, all fighting for Indigenous justice and framing a lot of the issues that we care about today on the left through this, through the lens of where Indigenous people have been organizing, you know, for forever. So they created this sort of counter to the Green New Deal, and they called it the Red Deal. And specifically, I want to, you know, if I have one thing that you remember from this teaching at all, is that it's not the Red New Deal. That's like a big point of emphasis, because I didn't get into it, but the Red Nation specifically wanted to call their vision the Red Deal, not the Red New Deal, because the original New Deal, even though we sort of borrowed the name for the Green New Deal, the original New Deal was super exclusionary. It left out Black folks, it left out a lot of poor folks, left out Indigenous people to a huge degree, as has sort of been the case throughout history. And you know, they want to break from this idea that, you know, something like the New Deal will save our society. So it's not the Red New Deal, it's the Red Deal. And it really furthers Green New Deal goals, but much more aimed at sort of like, how do we change the system? And how do we really work towards justice? So really quickly, I have so much time. I could probably just like babble on for forever, but I won't. So, because I'll save some time for questions. But briefly, the Red Deal has 4 main principles, and we'll go through each and sort of talk about them. The first is, they say, what creates crisis cannot solve it. Think about that. Sort of like Audre Lorde vibes, right? The second, change from the left and below. What does that make you feel? That makes me excited. Third, that politicians can't do what only mass movements do. So that's sort of what I was talking about before. And fourth, this is a broad one, but from theory to action, like we need to act. And these are all very inspiring. And I really strongly suggest reading through the documents that the Red Nation put out and read through the Red Deal, because it's really, really cool and rad and inspires me whenever I read it. So first, we can talk about what do we mean by, like, number one, what creates the crisis cannot solve it. So this is sort of getting at this idea of like, do we try to reform the structure, or do we say the structure is fundamentally broken? And if you take a more sort of radical, what's called radical view, it's that honestly, the incentives that exist in the current structure are not going to be able to solve the real problems. So we need something new. And the Red Deal talks about a really simple example is through divestment. And I'm sure that I see some Mass Peace Action folks in here. I'm sure you'll be happy about this example. They call for going beyond, fossil fuel divestment. This has been a huge central part of environmental campaigns. The original Sunrise Movement organizers and founders got their training and cut their teeth in fossil fuel divestment campaigns on college campuses. But that's not the end all be all, right? That's still sort of having the same system, but just sort of tweaking the knobs and dials. So they illustrate an example. Take the military budget, right? When we talk about the priorities of a country, right? The priorities of the United States. If you just take a look at this pie chart that was from the 2016 fiscal year proposed discretionary spending budget for the government. And I will say that the number, the 1.15 trillion, has only gone up since. Look at that huge portion that goes to the military, right? It's over half of the chart. And this is the discretionary spending. This is not even stuff that goes to like social safety programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. This is like the stuff that's like, okay, what do we want to do with the extra? And we get like a little bit for science. We get a little bit for whatever. Here's energy and environment, right? Gets 41.6 billion. Well, I guess actually Medicare and health are in here. Maybe I messed up. But anyways, other stuff like education only gets 74.1 billion. But the military got $625.2 billion out of this discretionary spending budget. That's wild, right? So it sort of says, is this the system that we want to try to like tweak? Is this the thing, like, is this the knob we want to try to turn to solve the crisis? It's like, no, we really need to replan our priorities. We shouldn't be spending so much money trying to, maintain global hegemony. We should really be investing it in our own country to combat the climate crisis. And we can easily fund a Green New Deal with that type of money. So it even gets to the structures underneath too of like, do we even want to be like a violent nation that sort of goes around the world imposing our will? Or do we want to work towards international cooperation, right? So these are all things that we can think about when we're like, okay, are we going to solve the crisis with the tools that have already created it? And second, change from the left and below, that's sort of talking about there is this contingency of like people who have always been fighting from, I guess, a standpoint that is painted as further to the left of even a Green New Deal. And below is like the people who are really affected by this type of thing. They need to be the folks who are like getting power from this type of transition, who are being really criminalized in the way that this system already works. They give the example of the No DAPL protests, so the Dakota Access Pipeline. And also, I think the Keystone XL one just got canceled, right? So that's a pretty good change in our direction. But when the protests were going on against the Dakota Access Pipeline, these water protectors, right, were like cracked down on with like the force of the state, right? And we even saw in the original, honestly, not even the original, even the racial justice uprisings of the summer, but including like protests in Ferguson, when the Black Lives Matter movement started to gain a lot of traction, folks were met with like severe military repression, right? I don't know if y'all were like in Boston during the summer, but there were like tanks in the streets and like soldiers with assault rifles like lining the commons. It was legitimately really scary. And it's creating this kind of like atmosphere, right? Where like there are like anti-protest laws being passed all like in a bunch of different states around the country. And there's this like severe crackdown because when change comes from the left and below, it really threatens the status quo. It's not just reform, it's literally we need to like change the way things work. And that means taking power away from people who have a lot of power, right? And they're kind of fighting back, right? So the Red Deal calls these types of changes that are being heavily repressed essential to righting the relationship between people and planet into eradicating class systems that sort of lead to a lot of the systemic inequities that lead to the climate crisis, right? And we need to organize around people power, is what they say, not lobbying legislators, who they call powerful people who won't give up power out of kindness. We need to really fight from the bottom. And this was a really cool example that I liked in the Red Deal too. Politicians can't do what only mass movements can do. Take the example of police brutality that we were sort of even talking about with the Black Lives Matter movement, which sort of, if you know, forgive my like pretty crude diagram, but it gives rise to things like there's no accountability for police, right? There's no transparency in like policing systems, among other issues. But that's sort of like at the top and gets brought about by police brutality as an issue. But underneath, it's like, okay, what is the real problem? Well, okay, maybe police brutality is like also a symptom of like rampant patriarchy in our society and systemic racism, white supremacy, valuing capital over people, right? Like property over humans, this culture of militarism that we live in. So when we talk about politicians doing certain things and mass movements doing certain things, it's like, okay, the politicians, they point out the state addresses the symptoms like we talked about earlier. So like body cams is the example they use. Body cameras are like aimed at accountability and transparency, but they do nothing to address all the root systemic issues, right? So they say movements address the root systemic issues. So if we're really to get rid of police brutality, we need to like pull that thing out by the roots, right? We need to address these systemic issues that are like literally the water we swim in. And that's something that only movements can do, right? So there's this idea that we have to think even further about sort of how I was saying with the Green New Deal. It's not just that justice is a nice to have, but it's actually necessary to avert climate catastrophe. With all issues, it's like, yeah, treating the underlying issues is not just a nice to have. It'll really be the only thing, a lot of people argue, that will actually eradicate the things that we don't like. So finally, the fourth one was from theory to action, right? So it's pretty simple, right? We're fighting up against the state, which is an organized body of power. They're very organized by default because it's just the way things work. So we have to organize. So it's sort of this idea, and then hopefully it'll kind of tie the whole thing together, that there are visions of much better worlds that we can live in beyond the degree of change that we already made in Biden's plan. And we know there's work to do on a lot of systemic underlying issues. How do we do it? We literally have to build power within people. So we have to organize, which is what Sunrise Movement does, which is what a lot of, I'm sure, organizations that you all are a part of do. Bring people together, get them to feel like they're not powerless, right? And then start to speak up and be acting and recruiting even more people and telling more people, hey, there's a better way we can live. Okay, so that was the Red Deal. So you can see, like, even beyond, the Green New Deal and the sort of Sanders-Inslee plan is like something that we can start to push for and we can learn more about. And it's the Biden plan is not even there yet. The Red Deal is even further. It has an even more bold, but I think appealing vision of a world where like we're actually in right relationship with each other. And there's so much we can do. And in Sunrise, we've been calling this, this is the time where we really kick off what we've been calling the decade of the Green New Deal. Like, mark it on your calendars, y'all. January 21st, 2021 is the first day of the decade of the Green New Deal. If we're gonna crush that 2030 deadline, we're gonna work like crazy, but in a way that doesn't generate burnout and stuff like that. So we're gonna share the burden with all of our friends and communities. We have an unprecedented opportunity, right? Especially with the new incoming administration, where we have a majority in the Senate and the House. What are we gonna do with that power, right? What are we gonna do with that time? So I wanted to just throw out a few things that we've been advocating for as a movement, where you all can sort of join us to kick off this decade of the Green New Deal. So first off, we can only focus on year one, right? A year is a long time, as we've all learned from the past year. it can seem like 10 years, and it can seem like a week. So let's just focus on 1 year. This is Sunrise's plan. These are the things we're going to fight for in year 1. So first, we have been devastated by the COVID pandemic, and we know that number one, we need immediate and direct relief to people. But sort of tying into what I was saying, are we going to fix the system, or are we going to tweak the dials of the system, or are we going to actually fix things? People need relief, not corporate CEOs or fossil fuel polluters. These are like, if you look, I think it's on our website, you can like look at the details of this plan. There's a bunch of common sense measures that we lay out that we needed 9 months ago, and have only become more urgent since. And every single person, regardless of immigration status or anything, needs these things to survive. And second part of our plan that we're calling for the first year is putting an end to this idea of republic minority rule that has just been crushing our hopes at democracy for quite a long time. And we want to ensure a true multiracial democracy that works for all of us. And the language wasn't in there, but I will also add multi-class because I think that's important. And it's this idea that every single time the GOP elites win power, they use it to erode democracy and dismantle all of the life-saving government programs of the first New Deal. Right? Their goal is like permanently entrenching this minority rule by a few rich white business people because they know it's really unpopular and they wouldn't win any other way. Right? So we need to push Democrats to move firmly to expand democracy and make the government work for actual people. And finally, this idea that we always harp on all the time, creating millions of good jobs, reversing systemic inequality, and putting a halt to the climate crisis through a historic green recovery. We have such a huge opportunity with COVID relief to push for the fact that it needs to address systemic inequalities. We say that Democrats should show us that they are on the side of working people and poor people by guaranteeing every American a good job, expanding workers' rights like we haven't seen since the 30s, delivering investment equitably to every community, whether Black, white, brown, indigenous, urban, rural, you name it. It's not just like good politics, it's literally necessary, like we said, to limit the catastrophe that would be 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And we know we need it to even just fix the economy and the awful devastation and trauma that's been inflicted on this country by ignoring the pandemic for an entire year. So these are the things that Sunrise is going to organize around. How might you get plugged in? Well, drum roll, there's this amazing coalition that has been being formed for the past couple of years and is really starting to gain a lot of momentum called the Green New Deal Network. It's a coalition of 15 different organizations. And honestly, doing work with any of these organizations, I won't even say you have to like volunteer with Sunrise. Doing work with any of these organizations will do a huge part towards moving to a just future under a Green New Deal. And the more we can work in coalition, the more we're building that power, that people power, so we can really push against the very well organized and powerful establishment. And I would recommend following them at Green New Deal Network. I think that's the Twitter handle. So if I'll leave you with one thing, this is all so exciting. I think it's rad. I hope you think it's rad. I'm sure a bunch of you on this call are already organized, but if you're not, or if you have other folks in your life who you think may be like coming out of this pandemic being like, holy shit, the world is whack, like it's really, really messed up right now. Let's get plugged in and let's plug other folks in. That's like the difference between activism and organizing, right? Let's like organize our people. I said it before, Sunrise has 400 hubs across the country. You could get plugged into Sunrise, you could get plugged into Sunrise Boston, you could get plugged into any of the organizations in the Green New Deal Network or any of the ones that are not. But just this idea of getting organized and building people power is so important at this moment. that we would love to have you in Sunrise, and I'm sure everyone else would love to have such cool folks who would show up to this call as well. And I'll put the final plug, if you want to hear about more stuff like this, or get notified about teach-ins or whatever, definitely follow us on Instagram and check out our newsletter. You can get on our email list somehow. Maybe people have info in the chat. But okay, I've been talking for a long time. That's it. Thank you. I will stop screen sharing, and maybe we can take some questions in the last 10 minutes. Ooh, I'm gonna drink some water. Yeah, Anne and Alex, did we have any super pressing or interesting questions? Oh yeah, okay, no, Anne has a good point. Put a star in the chat if you have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Anna. Do we have to unmute you? Let's see. Okay.
Hi. This was really awesome. Oh, sorry, I just messed my Zoom up. This was really awesome. Thank you all so much. I just had a question about the red deal and any work that and if anyone knows any work that Sunrise has done with the Red Nation at all around the red deal, because I had heard of it a little bit, but didn't know a ton about it, and so it was really awesome to learn more about it, and it's so dope. And so I was just wondering if Sunrise works with the Red Nation at all, or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. Thanks for asking that. To my knowledge, we don't do any super official we comment on the red deal, and they comment on our and the Red Nation comments on our type of plans or anything like that. I do know there are a ton of folks in Sunrise who are yeah, the red deal is dope. So in a sort of informal way, they've certainly influenced us. But from a national standpoint, I'm not entirely sure if they're probably in our partnerships network, but that could be a cool thing to look more into, and even at the hub level, partnering with folks who are maybe part of the Red Nation or Indigenous Environmental Network or something like that. It'd be really cool.
We have one question in the chat. I can read it from Rosalie. Given the makeup of Congress, is it politically more chancy to push for more radical solutions? Do we push but not expect the Biden admin to embrace less radical solutions? Thank you for that question, Rosalie.
Yes, thanks, Rosalie. Great question. Also, hi. Yeah, it's a great question. So, do we push but not expect the Biden administration to embrace less radical solutions? Do you mean push but not embrace more radical solutions? Oh, we can't unmute you here. Okay, yeah, I think I'm reading your lips. Yeah, so I think our philosophy in Sunrise is that by pushing even further, even if we don't expect these things to whatever fall under the category of politically feasible in the eyes of politicians, just by getting so many people excited about these things, we're forcing them to follow us. So I think what you said about the makeup of Congress is pretty important, because we fought for a lot of Green New Deal champions and elected a lot of really new leaders who will have a pretty instrumental role to play in supporting us when we push for even more bold legislation. But I do see your point too, that we may not expect it first out of the Biden administration, like a huge radical push. But I think if we get enough people behind it, we can make it really, really unpopular for them to not be as radical. It's a good question. And maybe I could even give for context, like the original Green New Deal was like, at least among legislators, was like not super popular. But after we like did huge mobilizations and like all of our partners and like other orgs did like teach-ins about the Green New Deal and like told everyone about it, it's become like such a staple that it's like, I mean, Biden, you know, he said like, I don't support a Green New Deal, but his plan is like basically on the road to a Green New Deal. So they can't ignore that type of stuff anymore. So it is interesting how much we can make those changes happen, just even if they will say on paper, you know, we don't support that type of thing. Very fascinating. Or maybe one more, because I'm a big fan of threes.
Nikki just asked, how can we push to defund the military?
Ooh, this is a great question. It's like right up my other alley. Yeah, I mean, it's it's tough, right? Like this country has a pretty entrenched mentality of like really enjoying the military. And there are a lot of reasons for that, right? I would encourage reading this great report called No Warming, No War, I think it's called, by the Institute for Policy Studies or the National Priorities Project or something like that. But suffice to say, this report pointed out the fact that like one of the reasons that the military has so much support in this country is because they're the only federal jobs program in the country. So when we're talking about a jobs guarantee, it's like, it kind of is one, but it's the military and it pays like crap. It's not a unionized job. It pays like something like $20,000 a year, which is just like garbage, not even a livable wage. But that's really like, so many folks are recruited into the military. They call it a poverty draft. Like the military service is less popular, but the way they get folks to enlist is because they're poor and they kind of need a way to like actually make ends meet and meet their material needs. So I think a huge part of changing the ideology to the point where we could defund the military, which is honestly very similar to like defund the police type of stuff, is like we need to put forward a different vision where it's like, we hear that the reason that the military is popular in a lot of ways is because of the fact that like we don't really serve poor people in the country with federal jobs programs at all. But a jobs guarantee through a Green New Deal would address that, right? And I'm sure that would like take a huge dent into this sort of idea of a poverty draft and then start to chip away at the ideology. But as with all things that I think about, I think pushing to defund the military will need something like a mass movement, right? Like it needs to just be like, now that you know about this like crazy military budget and sort of how the priorities are messed up, we need to like tell other people, right? We need to build that people power and build awareness and start to be like, hey, you don't like this too? Oh yeah, me too. Let's like do something about it. So yeah. Ooh, and someone just said, yeah, Mass Peace Action is hosting a Zoom conference, Invest in Mines, Not Missiles, this Saturday. And I think Rosalie and John and I will be there too. So we'll see you all. Thanks, Nina. Yeah, so I think that'll do it for the questions. Thank you so much. I'll say again, yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight, logging in through Zoom. I know it's kind of a slog to look at the screen for so long, but we really appreciate you all and the work that I'm sure you all are doing too. Keep in touch with Sunrise Boston and stay in tune for more cool stuff. I don't know if other Sunrise people want to say anything else, but I'll start playing the music to outro people.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks
I
so much.
appreciate everyone for all the hard work they put in on this. You guys did a really, really amazing job. Thank you all so much for coming too.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you,
Have a great
everyone.
night. Bye.
Bye.
I think I have to end the meeting. Should I end it or are we waiting for it?
You can either end it or you can give the host permissions back to me and I can stick around while people hang out.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And did you do the waiting room thing? Oh, maybe we could stop recording.
Anyways.